In the autumn of 1942, the German Sixth Army represented the pinnacle of Wehrmacht combat effectiveness. Comprised of roughly 300,000 of the most seasoned troops the German military could field, this fighting force had systematically dismantled Soviet defences across an enormous expanse of territory. From the Ukrainian steppes to the western bank of the Volga River, the Sixth Army had maintained an operational momentum that appeared almost unstoppable. Then, in a single strategic manoeuvre, the Soviet command initiated an operation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire war. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army executed Operation Uranus, a coordinated double envelopment designed with surgical precision. Soviet forces launched simultaneous offensives from both north and south, targeting the weaker flank positions held by Romanian units. Within days, these two prongs of the attack converged on the western side of Stalingrad, successfully encircling the entire German Sixth Army and trapping it within a shrinking perimeter from which there appeared to be no escape. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the surrounded force, immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of their situation. He transmitted urgent communications to German High Command, requesting authorization for an immediate breakout while tactical options still remained available. Hitler's response was definitive. No withdrawal would be authorized. Instead, the German leadership made a calculated decision that would prove fatally miscalculated. Hitler promised that the Luftwaffe would undertake an aerial resupply operation of unprecedented scale, delivering the hundreds of tons of food, ammunition, and fuel the trapped army required daily to sustain operations through the coming Russian winter. The reality on the ground diverged dramatically from this promise. The Luftwaffe, despite its best efforts, managed to deliver perhaps 1/5 of the required supplies on even the most successful days. As December transitioned into January, the men of the Sixth Army faced conditions of extraordinary hardship. They dismantled buildings to fuel fires for minimal warmth. They slaughtered the remaining horses to supplement their dwindling food supplies. Day by day, the Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, and the perimeter available to German defenders continued to contract. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler made a symbolic gesture. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a rank that carried with it a specific and unmistakable implication in German military tradition. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in the entire history of the Wehrmacht. Hitler's message was clear. The new field marshal was expected to understand what this honor truly meant. Paulus, however, chose to interpret his duty differently. On January 31st, 1943, he authorized the surrender of remaining German forces. The statistics that emerged from this catastrophe were staggering. Of the approximately 275,000 men who had been encircled by Soviet forces, roughly 150,000 had already perished during months of brutal combat and exposure to the Russian winter. This left 91,000 survivors, including 24 generals, who were marched into Soviet captivity. What followed was a tragedy, compounded upon tragedy. Of those 91,000 prisoners, only approximately 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The remainder would die in Soviet camps from exposure, malnutrition, and disease, a second form of death that continued long after the shooting had ceased. Some survivors would not see their homeland again until the 1950s, more than a decade after the war's conclusion. The significance of Stalingrad transcended the purely military dimensions. It represented the moment when the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, a perception carefully cultivated by German propaganda and initially validated by years of spectacular battlefield successes, shattered completely before the eyes of the entire world. Every German soldier on every front, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, felt something fundamental shift beneath them. The perception that German military superiority was inevitable began to dissolve. While Stalingrad delivered the decisive blow to German aspirations in Eastern Europe, the North African theatre witnessed a parallel humiliation that unfolded almost simultaneously. The destruction of the Afrika Korps, represented not merely a military setback, but the dismantling of a force commanded by one of the most celebrated and romanticized figures of the entire conflict, General Erwin Rommel, known throughout both German and Allied circles as the Desert Fox. Rommel's legend had grown substantially during his tenure in North Africa. His mechanized forces had achieved remarkable operational successes, driving British formations across the vast desert expanses and threatening to penetrate all the way to Egypt. The Suez Canal itself appeared to hang in the balance, and the maritime supply routes that sustained Allied operations throughout the Mediterranean seemed vulnerable to German interdiction. By the summer of 1942, Rommel's reputation for tactical brilliance reached its zenith. He seemed, to many observers, to be operating at a level of strategic sophistication that the British command had not yet learned to counter. This perception would be definitively challenged at El Alamein. Between October 23rd and November 4th, 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery committed his 8th Army to a grinding attritional campaign specifically designed to wear down the Afrika Korps through systematic destruction of its armoured strength. For 12 days, the battle raged across the desert with neither side yielding tactical ground easily. The German forces, however, lacked the reserves of men and equipment necessary to sustain the level of losses Montgomery's strategy inflicted upon them. When the battle concluded, the scale of German losses became apparent. Rommel's army had suffered approximately 12,000 casualties and lost roughly 350 tanks. Most critically, Rommel began his retreat westwards, with fewer than 80 operational tanks remaining, a devastating reduction in offensive capability. What followed was a desperate retreat across 1,400 miles of desert terrain, continuously harassed by British pursuit operations that maintained relentless pressure without allowing the German force any opportunity to establish a stable defensive line. The strategic situation deteriorated further when geopolitical circumstances shifted abruptly. In November 1942, American and British forces executed Operation Torch, landing simultaneously in Morocco and Algeria. This amphibious operation sealed any remaining escape routes and compressed the remaining Axis forces into an increasingly confined bridgehead centered on Tunisia. Rommel himself departed North Africa in March 1943, officially for medical reasons, though he effectively escaped the final denouement of the campaign he had championed. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa formally surrendered. The prisoner count was staggering. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken into captivity. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill immediately characterized this victory as comparable in strategic significance to the Soviet triumph at Stalingrad. The desert campaign that had captivated world attention and produced one of the war's most celebrated commanders concluded in total defeat and the effective elimination of Axis power projection in North Africa and the Mediterranean theatre. Following the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the German High Command faced an acute crisis of confidence. The military institution had suffered a devastating blow to its prestige and operational capability. The command structure desperately required a demonstrable victory, some concrete evidence that German forces retained the capacity to seize strategic initiative and dictate events on the Eastern Front, rather than merely reacting to Soviet initiatives. The Kursk salient appeared to present exactly such an opportunity. This geographical feature consisted of a massive bulge in the Soviet defensive line, measuring approximately 160 kilometers in width and 100 kilometers in depth. Examined on military planning maps, it resembled an invitation to execute a classical double envelopment, coordinated armoured assaults from both north and south that would pinch off the entire salient and encircle the Soviet forces within it. Hitler authorized Operation Citadel to exploit this apparent vulnerability. German forces committed approximately 900,000 troops and nearly 3,000 armoured vehicles to what was intended to be the last major strategic offensive operation the Wehrmacht would execute on the Eastern Front. The concentration of resources was extraordinary. The planning was meticulous. The confidence in ultimate success was substantial. What the German High Command did not comprehend, but Soviet military intelligence had discovered through various channels, was that the entire operational concept had been compromised. The Red Army possessed detailed foreknowledge of the German plan. Rather than react passively to German attacks, the Soviet command spent months constructing the most elaborate defensive system in military history, specifically tailored to absorb and neutralize exactly the type of armored assault the Germans were preparing to execute. The defensive preparations were extraordinary in scope. 8 successive lines of trenches were constructed throughout the salient. Minefields were planted with geometric precision. Anti-tank gun positions were sited in mutually supporting patterns. This defensive infrastructure stretched backward nearly 300 kilometers, designed from conception to absorb the shock of German attack and methodically wear down attacking armor through attritional exchanges that favored the defender. When German forces initiated Operation Citadel on July 5, 1943, they encountered these prepared defenses immediately. Tactical progress became agonizingly incremental. Advances that measured mere kilometers required days of fierce combat. The nature of warfare shifted from rapid exploitation to static slugging matches, where each position had to be reduced individually. On July 12th, the battle achieved its climactic moment near the town of Prokhorovka. Hundreds of armoured vehicles converged in the most concentrated tank engagement the war had yet witnessed. The fighting was chaotic and gruesome, with both sides suffering enormous losses. German armour demonstrated superior quality in individual tank designs, but Soviet forces possessed overwhelming numerical advantages. The engagement resulted in no territorial gains that German forces could maintain. The assault had achieved nothing except the consumption of irreplaceable military resources. Hitler made the decision to terminate Operation Citadel partway through the offensive. Multiple factors influenced this decision. The Allied invasion of Sicily on July 10th demanded that German military resources be redirected to address threats in the Mediterranean. The offensive's failure to achieve penetration became increasingly obvious to military command. The operational window for potential success had closed definitively. The German army extracted itself from the Kursk salient, having suffered tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of destroyed armoured vehicles. The strategic objective remained unachieved. More critically, this offensive represented the expenditure of the last reserve of genuine offensive energy the Wehrmacht possessed for Eastern Front operations. Every subsequent German military movement in the east would be a retreat operation, conducted under conditions of diminishing capability and increasing Soviet pressure. Among the vast catalogue of German military defeats that characterized the war's second half, one operation remains conspicuously absent from popular historical consciousness, despite representing arguably the largest single defeat of the entire conflict. Operation Bagration was named deliberately after Prince Mikhail Kutuzov's general, Pyotr Bagration, who had died at Borodino in 1812 while resisting Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The choice of designation was no accident. Russian military planners were consciously invoking the historical memory of Russia successfully destroying a previous conqueror who had penetrated deep into Russian territory. The operation was launched on June 23, 1944, precisely 2 weeks after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The timing was deliberately coordinated to place maximum strain on German military resources by forcing simultaneous crisis management in 2 different theatres. While world attention focused on Normandy, the Soviets initiated their assault against Army Group Center, the German formation responsible for maintaining defensive positions across Belarusia, Russian territories, and the Baltic region. The offensive was executed by 4 Soviet army groups in a coordinated assault of such tactical sophistication and operational scale that German command had not anticipated either the location or the concentration of force being deployed against them. The results transcended anything in previous German military experience. catastrophe began to unfold almost immediately. Within the following weeks, 28 of the 34 divisions comprising the German 3rd Panzer Army, 4th Army, and 9th Army were encircled and destroyed. German divisional and army headquarters ceased to exist as functioning organizations. The command and control infrastructure that held these forces together was obliterated. Approximately 350,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, and captured combined, were suffered in less than 2 months of continuous combat. This figure exceeded even the staggering losses at Stalingrad and represents one of the most complete destructions of a major military formation in modern military history. The operational consequences extended far beyond casualty statistics. By August 1944, barely 3 months after the offensive commenced, Soviet forces had advanced nearly 500 kilometers westwards. Red Army spearheads stood upon the Vistula River in Poland, positioning themselves within realistic striking distance of Berlin itself. The Soviet military machine had achieved operational sophistication that demonstrated superiority, not merely in quantitative measures like manpower and equipment, but in strategic vision, operational planning, and coordinated execution. The Wehrmacht had never demonstrated the capacity for operations of such scale and complexity, even during its most successful years. Parallel to the destruction of Army Group Centre unfolding across the vast eastern expanses, the Western Theatre was simultaneously experiencing an equally devastating collapse. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, initiated a grinding attritional battle in the Norman Bocage country that maintained relatively stable territorial lines throughout June and into July. German forces, despite inferior resources, fought with characteristic stubbornness and tactical competence. In late July, American forces achieved a crucial breakthrough at Saint-Lô. Armoured columns exploited this penetration, swinging rapidly around the German flank in a manoeuvre that threatened to encircle German formations still engaged in combat to the north. Simultaneously, Canadian forces drove southwards, creating the northern prong of an envelopment. The two arms of this encirclement began closing inexorably around tens of thousands of German troops, concentrated near the town of Falaise. The roads within the pocket became scenes of destruction, almost beyond literal description. Allied aircraft achieved near-total air superiority over the sector. Without meaningful air defence, attacking aircraft could strike the packed columns of retreating troops, horses, and vehicles with complete impunity. The casualties and destruction reached almost incomprehensible scales. When American Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower visited the pocket after the encirclement closed completely, he observed firsthand the magnitude of destruction. In his official report, he noted that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping exclusively on the bodies of dead soldiers and dead horses, without actually placing a foot on ground itself. The sheer density of death created an unprecedented landscape of human and material destruction. Within the pocket itself, approximately 10,000 German soldiers were killed in direct combat. Around 50,000 additional soldiers were captured. Certain formations managed to escape through a narrow gap before it sealed completely, but their escape was the escape of shattered remnants. Equipment was abandoned wholesale. Organisation dissolved. The formations that escaped were combat ineffective forces, suitable only for reconstruction and rehabilitation. The destruction of German formations in the Falaise Pocket effectively terminated organised German military resistance in France. Within days of the pocket's closure, the entire German defensive line in Normandy collapsed structurally. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated by Allied forces. The Falaise Pocket and Operation Bagration, occurring simultaneously across thousands of kilometres of front, marked the decisive moment when the German army transformed from a force capable of shaping major strategic events into a force primarily concerned with mere survival and delaying inevitable defeat. Military history contains few examples with the grim distinction that befell the German Sixth Army. After Stalingrad consumed the entire organization in the winter of 1942 to 1943, the German military undertook the extraordinary effort to reconstitute the Sixth Army entirely. The newly reformed unit was assigned to the southern portion of the Eastern Front, defending positions across Romanian territory. It returned to combat operations, ready once again to contest Soviet advances. Then, in August 1944, the Soviet Jassy-Kishinev offensive was launched. This operation tore through German and Romanian positions with devastating speed, achieving penetrations that shattered the coherent defense in a matter of days. Yet the military collapse, catastrophic though it was, represented only half of the disaster that unfolded. On August 23, 1944, a coup d'état was executed within Romania. King Michael arrested the fascist dictator Ion Antonescu and announced that Romania was immediately switching its allegiance from the Axis to the Allied powers. Romanian forces that had been fighting in coordination with German formations that very morning received new orders by afternoon. Weapons that had been directed against Soviet forces were abruptly turned against German allies. The entire German southern flank simply ceased to exist. Romanian defensive positions that German planners had relied upon to hold critical terrain dissolved. There was no prepared defensive line behind which German forces could consolidate. Soviet armour poured through the breach in overwhelming concentrations. The reconstituted Sixth Army was encircled and systematically destroyed for the second time in the war. The cascading geopolitical consequences were extraordinary. Bulgaria switched sides within weeks. German military positions throughout southeastern Europe became untenable. Yugoslavia and Hungary became contested territory within the German sphere of control. No other military formation in the entire war suffered quite this grim distinction. Destruction, reformation, and then destruction once again within the same theatre of operations, and within less than 2 years. Of all the catastrophic German military collapses that characterized 1944 to 1945, the Vistula-Oder Offensive witnessed the fastest deterioration of German military capability and the most complete destruction of organized defensive potential. This offensive, more than any other single operation, transformed Berlin's fall from a probable outcome into a mathematical certainty rather than merely a likely eventuality. By January 1945, the German defensive line in Poland had been worn down through 4 years of attrition to a shell of its former strength. The losses in killed, wounded, and missing had reached such magnitude that replacement pools could no longer sustain formations at anything approaching full strength. Despite this grim reality, German military maps still displayed what appeared to be a coherent defensive line, with divisions nominally assigned to specific sectors and positions. Army Group A, subsequently redesigned as Army Group Centre in the war's final administrative shuffling, held defensive positions along the Vistula River. This force was tasked with defending the approaches to Germany itself, the last geographical barrier before Soviet forces would be operating on German soil. The Soviets had invested months in preparation for this breakthrough operation. They had massed an overwhelming concentration of military force opposite the thin German line. More than 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and artillery support, so overwhelmingly superior that Soviet forces achieved artillery superiority ratios of upward of 250 guns for every kilometre of front in certain sectors. This concentration of firepower was unprecedented in the entire war. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet artillery preparation commenced, and the German defence system did not merely break, it functionally evaporated under the weight of the assault. Soviet spearheads under commanders including Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev tore through the remaining German defensive positions with such violence that coherent resistance became impossible to maintain. The rate of Soviet advance was nearly unprecedented in warfare, 30 to 40 kilometers daily, a pace that exceeded even the spectacular advances achieved during the German Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1941. Entire German divisions were systematically bypassed and encircled by the advancing Soviet columns, left to be eliminated by follow-on forces, while the main offensive thrust continued its relentless push westwards. Warsaw, continuously held by German forces since 1939, fell on January 17th. Krakow, another major city, fell within days. By the end of January, barely 3 weeks after the offensive commenced, Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River, the last major geographical barrier before Berlin, and established bridgeheads on German soil itself, less than 80 kilometers from the German capital. Army Group A had entered the offensive with approximately 400,000 combat personnel. Within weeks, this force had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Divisions were either destroyed outright in encirclement pockets along the Vistula, or shattered into disorganized remnants retreating westwards in advance of the Soviet onslaught. German casualty figures for the Vistula-Oder Offensive reached into the hundreds of thousands when killed, wounded and captured are combined. What distinguished this collapse from Stalingrad or Bagration was that destruction occurred not within a bounded encirclement where retreat was impossible, but across an entire collapsing front where there was literally nowhere left to establish a defensive position and hold it. Millions of German civilians caught in the path of the Soviet advance fled westwards in what constituted one of the largest single movements of refugees in European history. These refugee columns clogged the identical roads that German military forces required for reorganization and defensive preparation, accelerating the military disintegration process. Hitler's response mirrored his decisions at Stalingrad 2 years previously. He categorically refused to authorize strategic withdrawals until it was far too late for such movements to accomplish anything constructive. He relieved generals who requested authorization to conduct orderly retreats to more defensible positions. He issued orders designating certain cities as fortress towns to be held to the last defender regardless of broader strategic considerations. Several of these fortress cities, occupied under direct Hitler orders to defend regardless of surrounding military circumstances, became isolated and besieged weeks after the main Soviet offensive had swept past them. German troops were tied down in static defense of strategically irrelevant positions, while the genuine crisis, the undefended approaches to Berlin itself, remained unaddressed. Posen, one of the most significant fortress garrisons, held out until late February, with defenders finally being overrun in house-to-house combat within the medieval citadel. This siege consumed thousands of lives on both sides, for control of a city that had lost all strategic relevance the moment the Soviet advance crossed positions 100 kilometers further west. By early February 1945, the Vistula-Oder Offensive had positioned Soviet forces on the Oder River, with the bulk of the Wehrmacht's Eastern Defensive Force no longer existing in any organized formation. Zhukov's forces were positioned close enough to Berlin that rapid pursuit operations could theoretically have reached the capital within days. Some Soviet commanders did argue for exactly this course of action. Instead, the offensive paused for logistical consolidation and coordination with other operations still grinding forward in East Prussia. Yet this pause altered nothing fundamental about the offensive's accomplishments. Within 3 weeks, the Soviet operation had destroyed the primary force positioned between the Soviet Union and Berlin, and had accomplished this destruction with such overwhelming force that the subsequent fighting in April and May was less a battle in doubt than an inevitable conclusion being methodically executed. By April 1945, the entity calling itself the German Army had become barely recognizable as a military force. The Ninth Army, encircled in forests south of Berlin near Halbe, was attempting desperately to break westward through Soviet encirclement, motivated by the grim realization that surrender to American forces offered prospects superior to capture by Soviet forces. Inside Berlin itself, the city garrison included the Volkssturm, a militia comprising men over 50 and boys as young as 16, armed with rifles and anti-tank weapons, and instructed to stop the Red Army with minimal training and equipment that was frequently incomplete. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet assault on Berlin commenced with an artillery barrage involving over 40,000 guns firing simultaneously along the Oder front. Survivors described the sound as the earth itself making noise, an acoustic phenomenon created by the simultaneous firing of tens of thousands of artillery pieces. The Ninth Army's breakout attempt from Halbe Forest cost tens of thousands of casualties in bitter forest combat before the encircled German formation finally collapsed. Inside Berlin, street fighting progressed block by block, staircase by staircase, through an urban landscape that had been reduced to rubble by months of bombing. The psychological impact on German defenders ranged from determined resistance to utter resignation. Adolf Hitler, recognizing the inevitable conclusion, died by his own hand in the Führer bunker on April 30th, 1945. Soviet forces were engaging German defenders within city blocks of his underground position. Germany signed its unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The German military institution that had stood at the gates of Moscow in December 1941, that had advanced to the Volga River and the Caucasus Mountains, that had projected power across North Africa and dominated continental Europe, concluded its existence in the ruins of its own capital. The final defense was conducted by teenagers and pensioners in uniforms that did not fit them, fighting for a political regime that had already ceased to function in any meaningful capacity, defending a city that had ceased to exist in any significant sense. The journey from the gates of Moscow to the rubble of Berlin consumed less than 4 years. The circle closed with finality and absolute totality.